When I first moved into Cedar Ridge Lane, I thought I was stepping into the kind of peaceful neighborhood people write about in real estate brochures. It was quiet, clean, and full of perfectly trimmed lawns and pastel-colored mailboxes. The kind of place where neighbors wave at each other, and the loudest sound you hear is a distant lawnmower on Saturday mornings. After years of renting small apartments, I finally had my dream home. A beautiful two-story house with a wraparound porch and a massive oak tree shading the backyard. I remember the first morning I woke up there. The sunlight streamed through the blinds, the smell of fresh paint lingered in the air, and for the first time in years, I felt like I'd made it. The community was under an HOA, a homeowners association, but I didn't think much of it. The realtor mentioned it casually, saying it kept the neighborhood organized. That sounded fine to me. I figured it meant the streets would stay clean, the lawns tidy, and property values stable. For the first week, everything was perfect. I unpacked, mowed the lawn, and even waved to the neighbors as they walked their dogs. People seemed polite, though a bit cautious. There was this subtle sense of formality, like everyone was playing a role. I brushed it off, thinking it was just suburban manners. Then, one afternoon, I heard the knock. 3 sharp, deliberate taps on the door. When I opened it, there she was, the kind of person you can spot coming from a mile away. Mid-50s, perfectly ironed blouse, clipboard in hand, and an expression that could curdle milk. Her name was Karen, and she introduced herself as the president of the Cedar Ridge Homeowners Association. She smiled, but it was the kind of smile that didn't reach your eyes, the kind that says, "I'm in charge here." She handed me a thick folder of papers and said they were the community guidelines. It was less than a welcome package and more like a manual for how to live your life. Rules about everything: the height of your grass, the color of your mailbox, the type of curtains allowed to face the street, even the kind of outdoor lighting that was approved. I remember standing there, nodding politely, pretending to read, while my brain quietly screamed, "What did I just get myself into?" Still, I told myself it was fine. Rules are rules, right? Every community needs structure. So I went about my days trying to fit in, keeping my yard neat, and following every guideline to the letter. But it didn't take long to realize that Karen didn't just enforce the rules, she lived for them. The first notice came 2 weeks later, a bright yellow slip in my mailbox that read, "Violation notice, trash bins visible from street." Apparently, I'd taken mine out a few hours early. The next week, another notice, this time for having unapproved garden decor. The offense? A small solar light shaped like a hummingbird. At first, I laughed. It seemed so petty, it was almost funny. But as the weeks went on, the letters multiplied. My mailbox became a revolving door of warnings, citations, and fines. It was relentless. I started seeing her more often, too. Karen, pacing up and down the street with a clipboard, inspecting lawns like a general surveying a battlefield. Sometimes she'd stop in front of my house and just stare, taking notes, scribbling, moving on. Neighbors began avoiding me. They'd wave politely, but with a certain nervousness, like being seen talking to me might put them on his list, too. One older man even muttered under his breath one morning, "Good luck with her," before quickly walking away. Then came the final straw, a letter taped to my front door in big, bold letters. Notice of community hearing. You are in violation of multiple HOA regulations and must attend a mandatory review session this Thursday. Non-compliance may result in further action. It felt surreal. I'd only lived there for a month. What further action could she even take? Still, I went. The hearing was held in what used to be her garage, now converted into the HOA's so-called community office. There were folding chairs, a coffee machine that hadn't been cleaned in weeks, and a few board members who looked more exhausted than authoritative. Karen sat at the head of the table, papers stacked neatly in front of her. She listed my infractions one by one: grass height, porch lighting, mailbox color. The tone in her voice wasn't professional. It was personal, like she enjoyed watching me squirm. That was the moment I realized it wasn't about rules. It was about control. She didn't want order. She wanted obedience, and I had unknowingly become her new target. As I left the meeting, I tried to shake it off. Maybe she was just a power-hungry busybody. I told myself to let it go. But fate has a sense of humor, because on my way home, I noticed a "For Rent" sign on a beige house 2 lots down. My heart skipped. I knew that house. I owned it. It was one of several rental properties I had invested in years ago, houses scattered across the same county. I had completely forgotten that one of those was part of this neighborhood. And then it hit me. The name on the lease for that very house was hers. Karen, the self-proclaimed queen of the HOA. The woman who had just threatened to take action against me for porch lighting violations was living in my property. She was my tenant. I stood there for a moment, the absurdity of it washing over me. She didn't know. She had no idea who I was beyond the new homeowner she wanted to push around. That night, I couldn't stop smiling. Not out of pettiness, but out of poetic justice. For the first time since I'd moved in, I wasn't angry. I was calm. Because now, the game had changed. She thought she held all the power, but she didn't know that the very roof over her head, the one she lorded her authority under, belonged to me. And sooner or later, she was going to find out.
From the moment I realized Karen was living in one of my properties, the entire neighborhood felt different. Every glance, every notice, every petty violation, all of it took on a new layer of irony. She was so obsessed with controlling everyone else's homes that she'd completely forgotten to look at who controlled hers. But I didn't act right away. I wanted to understand exactly what kind of person I was dealing with, so I stayed quiet and let her keep playing her game. It didn't take long for her true colors to show. Within a week, I received 2 more violation notices, one for improper lawn edging and another for having non-approved exterior lighting. She was getting creative now. I could almost imagine her standing in front of my house at night with a flashlight, looking for reasons to find me. I started noticing small, calculated inconveniences, too. Trash collection mysteriously skipped my home. HOA newsletters were left out of my mailbox. My name was conveniently excluded from the neighborhood's email list. It was subtle, but deliberate. And then came the notice that crossed the line. Final warning: failure to comply with HOA standards may result in community action, including potential removal from residence. Removal? She was threatening to evict me from my own property. I remember standing in my kitchen holding that letter and laughing under my breath, not out of amusement, but disbelief. She had no idea how far out of her depth she was. But I wasn't ready to strike yet. Timing was everything. I wanted her to dig her own hole, to make her obsession undeniable. So I kept every notice, every printed email, every petty fine. I built a folder labeled Evidence, HOA Abuse, and watched as the pages filled up. Meanwhile, her hypocrisy became more obvious with every passing day. On my evening walks, I'd pass her house, the beige rental that technically belonged to me, and notice how her lawn was overgrown, how her gutters sagged, how paint peeled from her shutters. The very violations she cited others for, she was guilty of herself. And yet, every HOA newsletter proudly listed her as president. It was almost comical. A few of my neighbors started whispering to me quietly, once they realized I wasn't the villain she painted me to be. One couple mentioned how Karen had fined them for leaving holiday decorations up too long. Another man said he once demanded he repaint his fence because the shade of white was not uniform enough. It became clear that everyone on the street was scared of her. She ruled through fear, petty fines, threats of hearings, and constant gossip. The HOA wasn't an organization anymore. It was her personal kingdom. But the cracks were starting to show. One morning, I received a thick envelope in the mail, a formal HOA summons for what they called a compliance hearing. According to the letter, I had accumulated over a dozen unresolved violations which could result in a community vote for forced removal. It was absurd, but I went anyway. I wanted to see her in her element. The meeting took place in the same garage as before. Karen sat at the head of the table, her clipboard neatly stacked, her posture rigid. The room smelled like burnt coffee and fake authority. She listed my infractions like she was reading from scripture: grass height, mailbox color, porch design. The other board members barely paid attention. They'd heard it all before. When she was done, she looked pleased with herself. She expected me to argue, to beg for leniency, to acknowledge her control. But I said nothing. I just nodded, thanked her, and left. Because at that moment, I wasn't angry. I was patient. Outside, the air was cool, the sun setting over the row of nearly identical houses. As I walked past her driveway, I glanced at the beige siding of her rental, my rental. Her car was parked crooked, her trash bin still out from 2 days ago, her garden completely neglected. If she weren't the HOA president, she'd be drowning in fines. The irony was delicious. Over the next few days, the harassment only grew worse. She started showing up unannounced, walking the perimeter of my yard like a guard inspecting a prisoner. She even took pictures of my porch, claiming it violated aesthetic harmony. One afternoon, I saw her outside talking to 2 of my neighbors. Their faces said everything: annoyance, discomfort, fear. She was spreading something again, probably about me, probably about how I was bringing down the community. But what she didn't realize was that her reign was built on sand, and I was about to pull the tide in. I spent the next few nights going through my files, checking lease records, payment histories, and inspection reports. That's when I found it. Karen hadn't paid rent for 3 months. 3 full months. She'd been avoiding payment, sending partial transfers, and making excuses. The management company I used had emailed her all reminders, all ignored. Technically, she was already in breach of her lease. It was almost poetic. The self-appointed enforcer of rules and order was breaking the most basic rule of all: paying rent. I forwarded everything to my lawyer, a calm, methodical man who'd handled dozens of cases for me before. When I told him who the tenant was, he laughed. The HOA president? Oh, this will be fun. He drafted the paperwork immediately. A notice to vacate for non-payment and breach of lease agreement. It was clean, professional, and legally binding. But I didn't serve it right away. I waited, because I knew she was planning something. Sure enough, a few days later, I received one more letter, hand-delivered, sealed, and dripping with false authority. It claimed that the HOA board had voted to recommend removal of my residence for ongoing non-compliance. That was it. That was her last move. And it was time for mine. The next morning, I walked calmly down the street, the eviction notice in my hand. The air was crisp, the neighborhood quiet. Birds sang, sprinklers clicked, and for once, I felt completely in control. I stopped in front of her beige house, her fortress of hypocrisy, and slid the envelope into her mailbox. I didn't ring the bell. I didn't wait, because I knew that when she opened it, the power dynamic of Cedar Ridge Lane would flip forever.
The morning after I delivered the eviction notice, the neighborhood felt different, calmer. felt quieter, like the air itself knew a storm was brewing. For weeks, Karen had patrolled these streets like a queen guarding her castle. But that morning, the sidewalks were empty. Her car was still in the driveway, blinds drawn tight. It didn't take long for the first reaction to arrive. At exactly 9:17 a.m., my phone buzzed with a text from an unknown number. It was a string of angry messages, capital letters, exclamation points, and threats disguised as reminders of HOA authority. She demanded I withdraw the notice immediately, claiming it was invalid under community regulations. I didn't reply, because of course HOA regulations don't override state law or a legally binding lease agreement. For the first time since moving in, I felt an unfamiliar calm wash over me. Karen had spent weeks trying to intimidate me with her fake authority, but now the tables had turned, and I didn't need to shout, threaten, or argue. I just needed patience and paperwork. Still, I knew someone like her wouldn't go down quietly. She'd twist a story, try to make herself the victim, rally her little council of loyal followers. So before she could start spreading half-truths, I decided to build my defense the way she'd built her empire, with documentation. I pulled every piece of paper I collected since the day I moved in. Every violation notice, every fine, every screenshot of her emails. I printed them all, organized them by date, and slipped them into a thick binder. The cover page simply read, Evidence HOA Misconduct. Then I went deeper. Through my management company, I requested her full rental history, payment receipts, inspection reports, maintenance requests. It painted a clear picture. 3 months of unpaid rent, 2 ignored inspection notices, and a formal written warning from the property manager about failure to maintain premises. The hypocrisy was almost too perfect. The HOA president, the self-proclaimed protector of neighborhood standards, had broken nearly every rule in her own lease. By the end of the day, I had a complete case file that could crush any argument she might try to make. But I wasn't just building a defense anymore. I was preparing to end her reign. The next step was my lawyer. He was calm and efficient, the kind of man who never raised his voice, but always got results. When I dropped off the folder at his office, he flipped through the documents with a small, knowing smile. This, he said, is the cleanest case I've seen in months. Together, we drafted the official eviction filing, a document that made everything concrete. She had 30 days to vacate, pay her dues, or face formal removal through the county court. It was lawful, precise, and entirely within my rights as her landlord. I didn't rush to serve it. I wanted the timing to sting. That weekend, the HOA scheduled one of its infamous community meetings. They held it at the local clubhouse, the same place where residents were usually lectured about fence heights and approved mailboxes. I decided to attend, binder in hand. When I walked in, the room fell silent. Karen was there, standing at the front, her posture as rigid as ever. She was wearing her trademark pastel blazer, clutching a clipboard like it was a weapon. The meeting started as usual. She spoke about the importance of maintaining harmony, about certain homeowners refusing to comply. Her tone was sharp, but her voice trembled, just slightly. Everyone knew who she was talking about. I sat quietly in the back, waiting for her to finish. When she paused to sip water, I stood, holding the binder against my chest. The room shifted, a low ripple of whispers. She noticed me immediately, and her jaw tightened. But I didn't say a word. I didn't need to. I simply walked to the front, placed the binder on the table beside her notes, and looked her in the eye. Then I turned and walked out. No confrontation, no grand speech. Just silence and truth sitting there in plain sight for everyone to see. By the time I got home, my phone was already buzzing again. Not from Karen, but from neighbors. One by one, people began texting me things like, "Finally," "Good for you," and "About time someone stood up to her." Apparently, after I left, a few curious board members had opened the binder. The truth had started spreading faster than any rumor she had ever told. It didn't take long for the fallout to begin. The following Monday, Karen showed up at my door, not to apologize, of course, but to try to intimidate me. She left another letter taped to my door, this one claiming that I had violated HOA confidentiality by sharing internal communications. I added it to my growing pile of evidence without even reading the rest. 2 days later, my lawyer filed the eviction paperwork with the county clerk. The legal process was in motion, and just like that, the queen of Cedar Ridge Lane was standing on shaky ground. In the weeks that followed, her behavior grew erratic. She doubled down on HOA enforcement, issuing random fines to nearly everyone on the block. Some residents began ignoring her notices altogether. Others started calling her out publicly. What had once been fear was turning into open defiance. I stayed quiet. I didn't need to fight anymore. The system was doing it for me. Then one chilly morning, I came home to find an official-looking document taped to my front door. Not from the HOA this time, from the county. It was the court date for Karen's eviction hearing. I stood there on my porch for a long moment, reading the paper as the wind rustled through the trees. It felt surreal. This woman had tried to drive me out of my own home, had turned an entire neighborhood into a playground of control, and now she was the one facing removal. Poetic justice doesn't always come loud and dramatic. Sometimes it arrives quietly, in legal documents and signed orders. When the day of the hearing came, I didn't even have to attend. My lawyer handled everything. Karen tried to argue, of course, claimed she didn't know rent, that I was targeting her, that she had rights as HOA president, but the law doesn't care about clipboards or self-appointed titles. By the end of that week, the court ruled in my favor. She had 30 days to vacate. For the first time since moving into Cedar Ridge Lane, I slept soundly. No more notices, no more letters, just peace, the kind I thought I was buying when I first signed the mortgage. But I also knew this wasn't the end. People like Karen don't just walk away quietly. They scheme, they gossip, they claw for control until the very last moment. And as her moving deadline crept closer, I could feel something building. A final act of defiance before she'd have to hand over the keys. I didn't know the form it would take, but I knew one thing for certain. She wasn't done yet.
The day Karen found out the truth began like any other, at least for me. It was a calm, gray morning, the kind where the clouds hung low and the world felt still. I was sitting on my porch, sipping coffee, watching the quiet rhythm of the neighborhood. For once, I wasn't dreading what might show up in my mailbox. But down the street, at the beige house, her house, something was stirring. I saw her pacing across the driveway, waving her phone in the air, muttering to herself. Her face was red, her movements frantic. I didn't have to guess what it was about. The court documents had been delivered the day before. The official eviction notice, stamped, signed, and beyond argument. By now, word had spread through the entire neighborhood. The same residents she had bullied and fined for years were whispering to one another, sharing screenshots, quietly celebrating. For once, Cedar Ridge Lane was united, not in fear, but in collective relief. I could almost feel the shift in the air. She'd spent years ruling this community like a self-appointed monarch, dictating paint colors and patio furniture choices. Now, she was the one facing the consequences. That afternoon, I got a knock at my door. 3 sharp raps, the same rhythm she'd used the first day we met. I already knew who it was. I didn't open it. Through the frosted glass, I could see her silhouette, tense posture, one hand gripping her clipboard like a shield. After a few seconds, the knocking turned to pounding. Then silence. A minute later, I heard the sound of paper sliding under the door. I waited until she was gone before picking it up. It was a letter, handwritten this time, not one of her usual printed, official-looking documents. The handwriting was angry, messy, the ink slightly smeared. It said, "You think you can humiliate me? I am the HOA president. You can't evict me. You have no right to own property in this community if you refuse to follow our rules." I folded the letter neatly and placed it in my binder, right beside the others. Evidence, nothing more. But what made me pause wasn't the anger, it was the fear behind it. For the first time, Karen wasn't confident. She wasn't hiding behind technicalities or fake authority. She was panicking, and it was only going to get worse. The following week, I received an email from the HOA board, the first official communication I'd ever received that wasn't a fine. It was short, hesitant, almost apologetic. They were calling an emergency HOA meeting to discuss leadership concerns. The writing was on the wall. When the evening of the meeting came, I arrived early. The clubhouse buzzed with quiet energy. Neighbors who had once kept their heads down were now sitting taller, talking freely. The tension that had ruled the neighborhood for years was cracking open. Karen arrived last, clutching her binder like it was a lifeline. She looked exhausted, but her eyes still burned with defiance. She stood at the front of the room, trying to gather her composure, but the whispers were already louder than her voice. She opened the meeting with her usual introduction, as your HOA president, but this time no one clapped. Instead, one of the board members interrupted her, a man named Tom, who had always seemed too polite to challenge her. His voice was calm, steady. He said the board had received complaints, dozens of them, about misuse of power, selective enforcement, and personal targeting. He said the HOA's purpose was to maintain harmony, not fear. And then he said something that made her face freeze. Karen, we also learned you've been living in a property that you do not legally own, one for which you failed to pay rent for months. The room went silent. Every eye turned toward her. You could see it hit her, the realization, the horror. She blinked, her mouth opening slightly, as if searching for words that wouldn't come. Then, like a slow tide, her gaze shifted across the room, until it landed on me. Our eyes met. For a moment, time seemed to stop. Her face drained of color, and her posture crumbled. She finally understood. The man she'd been targeting, fining, and threatening to evict was her landlord. Her lips moved, forming silent words, disbelief, then anger. But before she could speak, Tom continued. He announced that the board had called for a vote of no confidence, an official removal of her position as president. Hands went up, every single one. Karen's reign was over. She stood there, stunned, as the vote passed unanimously. No one spoke. No one needed to. The silence was louder than any argument. She tried to gather her papers, fumbling with her binder, muttering under her breath. Her hands shook. She walked out of the room without looking back. And just like that, Cedar Ridge Lane exhaled for the first time in years. When I left the clubhouse that night, I felt something I hadn't felt since moving there. Peace. Real, quiet peace. The kind that doesn't depend on rules or authority. The kind that comes when justice finally lands where it belongs. A few days later, the moving truck arrived at her house. She didn't say a word to anyone. No goodbyes, no explanations, just boxes and silence. I watched from my porch as she loaded the last one, her shoulders slumped, her once perfect hair tied up in a messy knot. For the first time, she looked human, flawed, beaten, not by me, but by her own arrogance. When she drove away, the street felt lighter. The air seemed fresher, the colors brighter. Neighbors began talking again. Kids played outside. It was as if the entire neighborhood had been waiting for her shadow to lift. For a few weeks after, her name was still whispered now and then, not out of fear, but disbelief that someone could let a little power go so far to their head. I thought that was the end of it. But one thing I've learned about people like Karen, they never really go away quietly. They simmer. They plot. They find new ways to insert themselves into stories they no longer belong to. And a month later, when I checked the latest list of rental applications for one of my other properties across town, I saw her last name again. But it wasn't hers this time. It was her daughter's.
Life on Cedar Ridge Lane felt different after Karen's moving truck disappeared over the hill. For the first time since I'd bought the house, mornings were peaceful. No yellow notices, no slow-rolling SUVs pausing to photograph my porch. Just birds, sprinklers, and the sound of people actually talking again. Neighbors who used to scurry indoors when she walked by began to linger outside. Lawns were still neat, but now each yard had its own personality. Bright flowers here, mismatched patio chairs there. The street had color again. Even the HOA, stripped of its queen, felt human. The remaining board members rewrote rules, erased pointless fines, and stopped policing mailbox paint. I thought the chapter was closed. Weeks passed quietly. My binder of evidence sat untouched in a drawer, its job complete. Every night I'd sit on the porch with coffee, watching the lake turn gold under the sunset, grateful that the chaos was over. Then, one afternoon, my property manager called. He sounded casual at first, just running through routine updates on my rentals, but near the end of the call, he hesitated. "We've got a new application for the Maple Drive property," he said. "Solid credit score, background's clean, name's Emily Harper." The moment he said it, something clicked. Harper, Karen's last name. I asked him to email the file. When it arrived, I opened it, and there it was, in black and white. Same address on her driver's license, the beige house on Cedar Ridge Lane. Same emergency contact, Karen Harper, mother. For a long minute, I just stared at the screen. The irony was almost too much to process. After everything that had happened, after the eviction, after the public downfall, the same family was trying to rent from me again, this time under a new name. Part of me wanted to reject it immediately. The other part wanted to see how far this strange coincidence would go. So I approved the application. Quietly. I kept my name out of the paperwork, letting a management company handle everything. I wanted to watch from a distance, to see if the apple had fallen far from the tree, or not at all. At first, things seemed normal. Emily moved in with her boyfriend, hung fairy lights on the balcony, kept the place tidy. Rent came in on time, no complaints from neighbors. Maybe she was different, I thought. Maybe she'd grown up watching her mother's mistakes and learned from them. But 3 months later, the pattern began. The first report came from the couple next door. Late-night noise, they said. Parties that go until 2 a.m. Then another complaint. Trash left in the hallway, cigarette burns on the shared stairway rail. When my manager emailed her a polite reminder about community rules, her response was instant and defensive. She claimed the neighbors were targeting her, that she knew people in housing, that she'd talked to the board. The phrasing, the tone, it was like hearing her mother through someone else's keyboard. A chill ran down my spine. The entitlement, the self-righteousness, the way she twisted every gentle reminder into an accusation, it was all there, inherited perfectly. Over the next few weeks, the situation escalated. Noise violations turned into damage reports. She parked illegally, ignored warnings, and eventually stopped responding to emails altogether. When she finally answered, she said the words that sealed her fate. "You can't tell me what to do. My mother ran an HOA. We know our rights." It was surreal. History repeating itself almost word for word. I let the management company handle it formally. They sent notices, late fee statements, maintenance bills, all ignored. And once again, a familiar process began. Documentation, evidence, eviction. I never spoke to her directly. I didn't have to. The cycle was already running its course. But while the legal machinery moved, I found myself thinking about Karen, about how power, real or imagined, can twist a person. She'd turned rules into weapons, community into control, and now her daughter was walking the same path, swinging the same invisible sword at shadows that weren't there. The hearing for the Maple Drive property came and went without drama. Emily didn't show up. The judge granted termination of the lease. The apartment was emptied 2 weeks later. She'd vanished overnight, leaving behind a few boxes and a faint echo of her mother's arrogance. When I walked through the unit after the cleanup crew finished, I stood by the window for a while, looking out at the city skyline. The air smelled of fresh paint and quiet closure. For the second time in a year, a Harper had written their own ending, and I hadn't needed to lift a finger beyond following the law. Still, it didn't feel like victory. It felt like something else. Reflection, maybe. Because beneath the satisfaction was a trace of sadness. It was easy to hate Karen for what she'd done, but seeing her daughter repeat the same mistakes made me realize how deep those roots of entitlement went. Some lessons, it seemed, could only be learned through consequences. Back on Cedar Ridge Lane, life continued peacefully. The HOA elected new officers, reasonable ones. They sent newsletters about community barbecues instead of fines. Kids played basketball in driveways again. People waved for real, not out of obligation. Sometimes on Sunday evenings, I'd take a walk past Karen's old house. The new tenants had painted the shutters blue and planted roses along the porch. It looked alive, happy. A perfect symbol of what the neighborhood had become after the storm. Every now and then, I'd catch myself wondering where Karen went. Did she ever tell her daughter the truth about what happened? Did she ever admit, even to herself, that her obsession with control cost her everything? One afternoon, months later, I got my answer. Sort of. I was driving through town when I spotted a familiar face at a coffee shop patio. It was her, Karen, sitting alone, staring into a cup she hadn't touched. No clipboard, no phone, no power. Just a quiet woman lost in thought. For a moment, I almost stopped the car. Maybe to say hello, maybe to remind her that she once tried to evict me from my own home. But I didn't. I realized there was nothing left to say. She'd already lost the one thing she'd fought hardest to keep: control. And as I drove away, I felt something unexpected. Not anger, not revenge, but just closure. Because in the end, she'd taught me something valuable. The real authority doesn't come from titles, rules, or fear. It comes from patience, truth, and the quiet confidence of knowing who actually owns the ground you stand on. Cedar Ridge Lane was finally peaceful again, and for the first time, so was I.
Cedar Ridge Lane changed slowly, almost shyly, after Karen's departure. It wasn't overnight, and it wasn't dramatic, just small, steady steps back toward normal life. At first, it was the silence that stood out. No clipped footsteps echoing down the street at 6 a.m., no metallic thump of her clipboard closing after each inspection. The constant tension that had once wrapped around the neighborhood like barbed wire had finally loosened. And with that silence came something that had been missing for a long time: laughter. Families started sitting on their porches again. Kids rode bikes along the cul-de-sac without being told to keep to the sidewalk. Neighbors waved from their driveways, real waves this time, not the tight, forced smiles they used to give when Karen's car passed by. I remember one Saturday morning in particular. It was the first community gathering the HOA had hosted under the new board. They'd sent out a simple flyer: neighborhood breakfast. Bring a dish, bring a chair, bring yourself. No rules, no sign-up sheet, no fines for mismatched tablecloth. I arrived with a tray of cinnamon rolls, not expecting much. But when I turned the corner, I stopped dead in my tracks. The park was packed. Every household had showed up. Tables were covered with homemade dishes, kids ran between the picnic benches, and someone had even brought a speaker playing old pop songs. It wasn't perfect, but it was real, and for Cedar Ridge, real was a kind of miracle. People came up to me throughout the morning. Neighbors who had once avoided eye contact now laughing, shaking my hand, thanking me without quite saying why. Some mentioned how good it feels to breathe again. Others simply said, "It's nice to have peace." Peace. It was such a simple word, but after everything that had happened, it felt enormous. For months, I'd lived under Karen's watchful eye. Every move documented, every decision questioned, every moment shadowed by her need for control. And yet, in the end, she hadn't destroyed the neighborhood. She had only delayed its growth.
People like her can't really kill a community. They can only make it forget itself for a while. As the weeks passed, small transformations began to bloom. A couple repainted their shutters a bright coral color, a shade Karen would have written up instantly. Another family installed a whimsical garden gnome that would have violated decorative guidelines. Now those little acts of rebellion had become emblems of freedom. And slowly, Cedar Ridge became beautiful again. Not in the rigid, copy-paste way Karen had demanded, but in the messy, human way it was always meant to be. I realized something else too. Control and care aren't the same thing. Karen had always claimed she was protecting the neighborhood, but what she'd really been protecting was her ego, the illusion that she was indispensable. The new HOA proved how wrong she had been. They ran things quietly, efficiently, and most importantly, fairly. Rules still existed, but they were rooted in reason, not revenge. Violations were met with conversation, not condemnation. And for the first time, people actually volunteered to join the board. Even I was asked to take a seat. I politely declined. I'd had enough of HOA politics to last a lifetime. Instead, I focused on my work, my properties, and my own home, the one I'd almost lost to her power trip. It was strange how quickly normal life felt new again. Simple things. Mowing the lawn without second-guessing the blade height, repainting my porch swing, planting ivy along the fence, all felt like acts of quiet victory. Sometimes I'd still think about Karen. Not often, and not with anger anymore. Just curiosity. Where she'd gone. Whether she had changed. Whether she ever looked back and realized the irony of it all. Because that was the thing about karma. It doesn't always roar. Sometimes it just waits patiently, letting people trip over their own footprints. One afternoon, I got an unexpected reminder of that truth. A letter arrived in the mail, forwarded from my property manager. It was addressed to me personally, from an out-of-town attorney's office. The envelope was plain, the handwriting unfamiliar. Inside was a short message typed neatly on letterhead. It said, "To the owner of 145 Cedar Ridge Lane, we are writing to inform you that your former tenant, Karen Harper, recently passed away following a prolonged illness. Among her personal documents, your name appeared in correspondence related to her previous residence. We extend our condolences." I sat with the letter for a long time, reading and rereading it. It didn't spark joy or satisfaction, just quiet reflection. She was gone. The woman who had tried to evict me from my own home, who had ruled an entire neighborhood with intimidation and arrogance, was no longer part of this world. And somehow, that realization softened everything. Because at the end of the day, beneath the blazers, the clipboard, and the power games, she'd been human. Flawed, desperate for control, terrified of losing it, but human nonetheless. I didn't tell the neighbors. There was no need. Her story had already ended on Cedar Ridge Lane. There was no reason to reopen it. But that night, I walked to the edge of the cul-de-sac, looked down the quiet street, and whispered a small, private goodbye. Not to the woman she had been, but to the chaos she had left behind. Then I went home, poured a cup of coffee, and sat by the window watching the last light fade over the neighborhood she had once ruled. It struck me in that moment how different everything looked. The lawns, the houses, the people, they hadn't changed much in shape or size. But the energy, the soul of the place had healed. Cedar Ridge Lane had survived her. It had learned, adapted, and finally remembered what community was supposed to mean. And maybe, in her own twisted way, Karen had been a necessary storm, the kind that tears down old branches so new ones can grow. Life moved forward. The HOA prospered quietly. My rentals thrived. The neighborhood found its rhythm. And though her shadow had once darkened every corner of our lives, now it was just that, a shadow, nothing more. When I looked around at the homes glowing softly in the evening light, I realized something profound.
Power fades. Control breaks. But peace, once earned, stays. And as the night deepened over Cedar Ridge Lane, I knew finally that the story was almost over. Almost. Because sometimes, even when everything seems settled, a final surprise still waits around the corner.
Months drifted by after the letter about Karen's passing. Cedar Ridge Lane slipped into a kind of peaceful routine, the kind that only arrives after long storms. Lawns flourished, the lake shimmered in the late summer sun, and even the mailbox that had once carried threats now filled only with coupons and holiday flyers. The story should have ended there, but life rarely stops neatly where we expect it to. It was early autumn when the final chapter began, one of those crisp mornings when the air smells faintly of wood smoke and change. I was sorting through lease renewals when a familiar address caught my eye, 145 Cedar Ridge Lane. That was Karen's old house. The current tenants, an easygoing couple who'd moved in after the eviction, had decided to relocate for work. Nothing dramatic, just life moving forward. The property manager asked if I wanted to list it again or sell it outright. For the first time, I hesitated. That house carried too many memories. The endless notices, the late-night arguments echoing across the street, the sight of Karen's car idling by my driveway like a patrol vehicle. Still, business was business. I agreed to list it. Within days, applications poured in, but one stood out, not for who it was, but for what it said. Under additional comments, the applicant had written only 3 words: seeking a fresh start. The name on the file was Margaret Holt. I didn't recognize it. Yet something about that phrase stuck with me. A fresh start. Those words had weight in this neighborhood. The application was clean, steady income, no red flags. I approved it. When move-in day arrived, I watched from my porch as a small moving truck pulled up. A woman stepped out, mid-50s, short hair, simple clothes, a quiet, measured way of moving. Nothing about her screamed HOA tyrant. She waved politely at me as she carried a box to the porch. For a moment, I thought nothing more of it. But the next afternoon, the mail carrier accidentally delivered one of her envelopes to my house. It was a letter addressed to Margaret Holt from an insurance company. Out of habit, I walked it over. She answered the door with a tired smile, thanked me softly, and for just a second I saw it, the faintest flicker of recognition in her eyes. Familiar somehow. That night I couldn't shake the feeling. The next day, curiosity got the better of me. I checked the public property records. Margaret Holt wasn't an alias. It was her maiden name. Karen Harper. She'd come back, not in triumph, not in fury, just quietly, under a different name, renting the same house she'd once ruled over. No HOA title, no clipboard, just another tenant trying to start again. For days, I didn't know what to feel. Anger? Pity? Maybe both. The idea of her living there again, right across the street, felt surreal. Yet at the same time, she seemed different. Smaller. Calmer. Weeks passed before I saw her again. She kept to herself, mostly, planting flowers, repainting the fence, walking a small dog every evening at dusk. She nodded politely whenever we crossed paths, but never stopped to talk. The neighbors whispered at first, recognizing her face, but soon the gossip faded. Without the authority of her title, she was just another resident. And that was the real twist. The woman who had once demanded absolute control over every blade of grass on Cedar Ridge Lane now tended her own garden quietly, trimming vines, smiling faintly when the neighborhood kids rode by. Sometimes I'd catch her pausing on the sidewalk, looking up at my porch, her eyes soft, thoughtful, maybe even apologetic. We never spoke,
But in those silent exchanges, something unspoken passed between us. Understanding, perhaps. Acceptance. The war was long over, and both sides had changed. One chilly December evening, as the first snow began to fall, I saw her leave a small envelope on my porch. No name on the outside, just neat handwriting. Inside was a short note. For years, I thought control kept things safe. It only made everything fragile. Thank you for reminding me that peace can grow where fear once lived. No signature, but none was needed. I folded the note carefully and slipped it into the old binder, the same binder that once held every violation, every fine, every record of her war against me. Now, at the very end, that binder closed on a different kind of evidence: forgiveness. After that night, she kept to herself. Seasons turned quietly. Her garden bloomed each spring with colors the HOA would once have banned. Wild, mismatched, alive. The neighbors began to stop by, drawn to her warmth. Somehow, against all odds, Karen Harper, the woman who had once divided an entire community, became part of it again. When she finally moved away 2 years later, there were no angry meetings, no notices, no gossip, just hugs, small gifts, and a neighborhood that had learned to let go. And I realized something profound as I watched her drive away for the last time. Justice had already been served years ago, but redemption, quiet, humble redemption, had taken longer. Maybe that was how it was meant to be. Because in the end, the story wasn't about revenge. It was about balance, about how power built on fear will always crumble, but understanding, earned slowly, painfully, can rebuild what fear destroyed. Cedar Ridge Lane stood as proof of that. The lawns still glowed green, the mailboxes still stood straight, but now every imperfection, every quirk, every mismatched color was a reminder of freedom. And every evening when I sat on my porch watching the sun dip low behind the houses, I felt a calm that went deeper than victory. It was the calm of closure, the knowledge that the circle had finally completed itself. Karen had once tried to evict me from my own home. Now she had quietly returned, not as a tyrant, but as a neighbor seeking peace. And in that quiet ending, she'd finally found it. As for me, I'd stopped being just the man who owned the house across the street. I'd become the silent witness to how even the loudest storms eventually fade, leaving only the soft rustle of leaves and the faint echo of lessons learned. And whenever people ask me about the HOA Karen story, the one that went viral, the one that everyone still whispers about, I smile, sip my coffee, and tell them the truth, that the best revenge wasn't the eviction. It was watching her finally learn what home really meant.